Hey guys, tonight we are diving into the real Wild West. Not the Hollywood version with its heroic cowboys and dramatic showdowns, but the gritty, dangerous reality where survival was never guaranteed. You might think you're tough enough to handle it, but trust me, there's a reason they called it wild. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'm always curious where you all are listening from, so drop a comment with your location and what time it is there. Love seeing our little global community connect through these stories. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Congratulations, you've just woken up in the American Wild West of the 1870s. The good news? You're about to experience a legendary chapter of history firsthand. The bad news? Your chances of survival just dropped dramatically. And we're only seconds into this. The first challenge hits you before you even open your eyes. It's the smell, not the earthy, pleasant aroma of nature you might expect, but something far more pungent. The stench of unwashed bodies, animal droppings, and what might possibly be raw sewage hanging heavy in the air. You see, bathing wasn't exactly a priority in the Wild West. Most settlers considered a thorough wash a monthly luxury, and that's being generous. Some went entire winters without a proper bath. Water, after all, was precious out here, and using it to clean yourself seemed wasteful when you needed it for drinking and cooking. Here's a quirky historical tidbit. Some frontier folk actually believed that bathing opened your pores to disease, a folk belief that persisted even as germ theory was beginning to emerge in medical circles back east. As you drag yourself from your bed, which is likely just a straw-filled mattress crawling with bed bugs, you realize how every muscle in your body aches. Life in the 1870s frontier involved constant physical labor from dawn until dusk. There were no weekends off, no vacations, and certainly no ergonomic considerations. Whether you were a farmer, miner, or ranch hand, your body was your primary tool, used until it broke down. You might think you work hard in your modern life, but frontier labor was something entirely different. Back-breaking work that left even the strongest people permanently hunched and arthritic by their 30s. Imagine spending 14 hours plowing fields, hauling water, chopping wood, or working deep underground in a mine shaft. No wonder the average lifespan was only about 35 years. Historians still argue whether that figure includes child mortality skewing the average downward, or whether frontier adults genuinely face such shortened lifespans. But either way, the picture is grim. Standing on the dusty floor, you notice the chill in the air. If it's winter, your cabin might be 20 degrees below freezing inside. If you had a fireplace, you'd have let it burn down overnight to save precious fuel. Good luck finding central heating or thermal underwear in this century. And if it's summer, get ready to sweat through every article of clothing you own. There's no escaping the elements in the Wild West. Your cabin's walls are thin, poorly insulated, and probably drafty enough that you can see daylight through the cracks in places. The temperature inside might only be 5 or 10 degrees different from outside, making winter nights genuinely life-threatening. if you're not careful. Speaking of clothing, forget comfort. Men typically owned maybe two sets of clothes: rough canvas or denim pants, and cotton shirts that chafed against the skin. Women wore multiple layers regardless of the temperature: chemises, corsets, petticoats, and long dresses that dragged in the dirt, collecting mud, manure, and other frontier grime. Everything was scratchy, ill-fitting, and rarely cleaned. Those fancy outfits you've seen in Western movies? Pure fiction for the average person. If you were wealthy, sure, you might have imported fabrics and tailored fits. For everyone else, clothing was purely functional, designed to provide warmth and minimal coverage, not style. Your stomach growls, reminding you it's time for breakfast. Hope you like beans, biscuits, and coffee, possibly for every meal. The Wild West diet was monotonous and nutritionally deficient. Fresh fruits and vegetables were seasonal luxuries. Meat, when available, was often preserved with salt or smoke because refrigeration didn't exist. Scurvy, that disease caused by vitamin C deficiency, where your gums bleed and your teeth fall out, was common among settlers despite being easily preventable with modern knowledge. You might think the coffee would at least be good. Cowboys always seem to have a pot brewing in the movies, but what you're served barely resembles what you'd recognize as coffee. It's typically boiled to within an inch of its life, bitter beyond belief, and might include crushed eggshells or even salt to reduce the bitterness. Still, the caffeine would help you face the day, so you drink it without complaint. Before heading outside, you might want to check your shoes for scorpions or snakes that could have sought shelter during the night. It wasn't uncommon for frontier folks to shake out their boots each morning, a habit born from painful experience. One wrong move, and you could be facing a venomous bite miles from any medical help. This was the genuine frontier reality that Hollywood rarely touches. Not dramatic confrontations, but the constant low-level threat of nature's smaller dangers. Stepping outside your cabin, you're immediately aware of how exposed you are. The vast landscape of the American frontier was breathtaking, sure, but it was also unforgiving. Extreme weather could appear with little warning. Blizzards, tornadoes, flash floods, or drought could all mean death for the unprepared. The sky might be clear now, but that could change in minutes. You're standing at the edge of an immense, largely untamed landscape with minimal shelter, minimal resources, and no emergency services within 100 miles. If you've settled in a frontier town, you might think civilization offers some protection. In some ways, that's true. In others, it just presents different dangers. Towns in the Wild West were hotbeds of disease. Without proper sewage systems or understanding of germ theory, illnesses spread rapidly through communities. Cholera, typhoid, smallpox, diphtheria, and tuberculosis were constant threats. An outbreak could wipe out half a town in weeks. The historical record shows that many frontier towns experienced mortality rates during disease outbreaks that rivaled war zones. Yet these epidemics rarely captured the public imagination like dramatic gunfights would later do. Speaking of towns, let's say you decide to visit one today. As you approach, you notice there's a distinct lack of the organized layout you might expect. Many Western towns grew haphazardly with buildings constructed wherever convenient, often without proper planning or infrastructure. The streets aren't paved, but are instead dirt tracks that transform into mud pits when it rains and dust bowls when it's dry. The smell hits you again, stronger. Now, horse manure is everywhere because horses are the main transportation. There are no street cleaners or sanitation departments. In some towns, the accumulated waste could be knee-deep in heavily trafficked areas. Flies swarm around you, and you realize why disease spreads so easily here. A quirky historical detail: some frontier towns actually had more horses than people, creating waste management challenges that historians have largely overlooked until recently. Some scholars estimate that a single busy frontier street could accumulate several tons of manure per week during peak seasons. As you walk down the main street, you pass the saloon, likely one of the busiest establishments in town. Contrary to Hollywood depictions, saloons weren't glamorous places with swinging doors and piano players. Most were crude, one-room affairs with rough plank bars and basic furniture. The liquor served wasn't fine whiskey aged in oak barrels, but raw alcohol often mixed with tobacco juice, pepper, turpentine, or even gunpowder to give it extra kick. A single drink could blind you if you were unlucky. The saloon represents another deadly aspect of frontier life: violence. These establishments were frequently sites of deadly confrontations, not because of formal duels or showdowns, but because of drunken arguments that escalated quickly in a heavily armed society. The romanticized gunfights of Western movies were rare. Most violence was impulsive, messy, and over trivial matters. A man might shoot another over a disputed card game, a perceived insult, or simply because both had been drinking for hours and tempers ignited. Historians still argue whether frontier violence was actually more common than in eastern cities of the same era, or whether the lower population density simply made each incident more memorable and culturally significant. What's certain is that violence in saloons was sudden, chaotic, and lacked any sense of honor or fairness. Speaking of being armed, you'll notice almost everyone carries a weapon of some kind, but not for the reasons you might think. While personal protection was certainly a factor, weapons were primarily tools for hunting, protection from wildlife, and sometimes for signaling the constant threat from bears, wolves, cougars, and venomous snakes made going unarmed foolish, especially when traveling between settlements. Interestingly, many frontier towns actually had strict gun control laws. Places like Dodge City, Kansas, and Tombstone, Arizona, required visitors to surrender their firearms when entering town limits. The famous gunfight at the OK Corral actually started because the Clanton gang refused to comply with Tombstone's weapons ordinance. This detail, that the Old West had more gun regulation than many modern American cities, rarely makes it into the popular narrative. Despite what you've seen in movies, quick-draw duels in the middle of the street were exceedingly rare. Most shootings were ambushes or happened during robberies. The skilled gunslinger facing off against an opponent at high noon is largely a Hollywood invention. Real frontier violence was typically sudden, chaotic, and lacked any sense of honor or fairness. You might be shot in the back, while sitting at a poker table. You might be ambushed on a dark street by someone you'd offended weeks earlier. You might be caught in crossfire between two drunk men arguing about something you weren't even involved in. As you continue your walk, you pass the local doctor's office. Medical care in the 1870s frontier would horrify you. Most doctors had little or no formal training. Surgical procedures were performed without anesthesia beyond whiskey or morphine, and sterilization was virtually unknown. Something as simple as an infected cut could lead to amputation or death. Common treatments included bloodletting, mercury compounds, arsenic, and other toxic substances that often did more harm than good. Women in childbirth faced mortality rates as high as 1 in 4 in remote areas. Dentistry involved extraction without anesthesia, using crude tools. Most people suffered from painful dental issues for years before finally losing their teeth. If you were injured or fell ill on the frontier, your survival often depended more on luck than medical intervention. Even minor injuries could become life-threatening due to infection. Broken bones might never heal properly, leaving frontier folk with chronic pain and disability. The famous phrase, "Only the strong survive," had literal meaning in the Wild West. Your body had to be resilient enough to recover from injuries with minimal professional help, and many bodies simply weren't. Your stomach growls again, and you realize it's time for lunch. You head to the local restaurant, which is likely just an extension of someone's home where meals are served for a fee. The food isn't any more varied than your breakfast. Meat is tough and often spoiled. Despite heavy smoking or salting, vegetables, if available, are overcooked to mush. Food safety standards don't exist, so dysentery and food poisoning are common occurrences. While eating, you overhear conversations about recent Indian attacks, outlaw gangs, or the danger of traveling alone. While Native American violence against settlers was far less common than portrayed in popular culture, in fact, settlers and the U.S. military were far more likely to be the aggressors. The frontier was still a place of conflict. The systematic displacement of indigenous peoples created tensions that sometimes erupted into violence on both sides. As for outlaws, they were a genuine threat, particularly in remote areas. Law enforcement was sparse, with a single sheriff sometimes responsible for thousands of square miles. In many places, justice was handled through vigilante action rather than formal legal proceedings. Lynch mobs were common, and the concept of innocent until proven guilty often didn't apply. If you were accused of horse theft or cattle rustling, you might find yourself hanging from a tree before sunset, regardless of your actual guilt or innocence. After lunch, you decide to visit the local general store to stock up on supplies. The prices shock you. Basic necessities cost far more on the frontier than back east due to the difficulty and expense of transportation. A simple can of peaches might cost the equivalent of $20 in today's money. Many settlers spent most of their income on essential supplies, with little left over for comfort or luxury. The store offers another glimpse into frontier reality. The isolation. Mail delivery was infrequent and unreliable. Newspapers might be weeks or months out of date. Information traveled slowly, and you might go years without news from family back east. Many settlers never saw their relatives again after moving west. The psychological toll of this isolation contributed to high rates of depression, alcoholism, and suicide among frontier populations. As the afternoon wears on, you notice dark clouds gathering on the horizon. Weather on the frontier wasn't just uncomfortable, it could be deadly. Without modern forecasting, storms arrived with little warning. Blizzards could strand travelers, leading to freezing deaths. Tornadoes destroyed entire communities with no emergency services to assist survivors. Flash floods washed away wagon trains. Droughts ruined crops and caused starvation. If you were lucky enough to have a proper home, it provided minimal protection. Most frontier dwellings were hastily constructed from whatever materials were available. Sod houses on the plains, log cabins in forested regions, or simple wooden structures in towns. None were particularly effective against extreme weather. Winter temperatures inside could drop below freezing. Summer heat was often unbearable, especially in attics or upper floors where many people slept. As the storm approaches, you decide to head back to your cabin before it hits. On the way, you pass a group of men heading to work at the local mine. Mining was one of the deadliest professions on the frontier. Underground cave-ins, toxic gas exposure, explosions from improperly handled blasting powder, and machinery accidents claimed countless lives. Miners also suffered from long-term health issues like black lung from coal dust or mercury poisoning from gold processing. Even if you avoided mining, few frontier occupations were safe. Farming involved dangerous equipment with no safety features. Ranching meant working with unpredictable animals weighing hundreds of pounds. Logging had one of the highest fatality rates of any profession. Whatever you did to make a living, your risk of serious injury or death was exponentially higher than in the modern world. You make it back to your cabin just as the rain begins to fall. The roof leaks in several places, and you place buckets to catch the water. This is actually a good opportunity to refill your drinking water. As clean water was scarce and precious, many frontier settlers drank from the same sources used for washing and watering livestock, leading to waterborne illnesses that could quickly turn fatal. Cholera, typhoid, and dysentery didn't care whether you boiled your water or not, though boiling did help. Most frontier people didn't understand the connection between contaminated water and disease. As you sit in your leaky cabin listening to the rain, you reflect on how different reality is from the romanticized version of the Wild West. There were no heroes or villains, just people struggling to survive in incredibly harsh conditions. The fact that anyone made it through is testament to human resilience and determination. Nightfall comes early because you have no electricity. Candles and oil lamps provide minimal illumination, and you're careful with them. Fire was a constant danger in frontier homes. A single spark could mean losing everything with no fire department to call for help. Many towns burnt to the ground at least once in their history. You prepare for bed, exhausted from just one day in the Wild West. Your muscles ache. Your stomach is unsettled from the unfamiliar food, and your mind is overwhelmed by the constant vigilance required to stay alive. But sleep will have to wait, because tomorrow, if you're lucky enough to see it, will bring all these challenges again, along with new ones you haven't yet imagined. The wind howls outside your cabin, a haunting reminder of how small and vulnerable humans are against the vastness of the untamed wilderness. The morning light filters through the cracks in your cabin walls, waking you from a restless sleep. Your body aches from the hard mattress, but there's no time to linger. The Wild West waits for no one. As you rise, you remember yesterday's harsh introduction to frontier life and wonder what new challenges today will bring. Let's say you decide to leave town today to travel across the frontier. Whether you're heading to another settlement, joining a wagon train west, or simply exploring, travel in the 1870s was an entirely different experience than what you're used to. The good news is that by this time, the Transcontinental Railroad had been completed, connecting the east and west coasts of America. The bad news? Unless you were relatively wealthy or traveling between major cities, you probably couldn't afford to use it. Most frontier folk traveled by horse, wagon, or simply on foot. If you owned a horse, consider yourself fortunate. Horses were expensive to buy and maintain, putting them out of reach for many settlers. A good horse might cost the equivalent of several months' wages. Then you needed saddles, bridles, feed, and veterinary care, though veterinary care often meant shooting the animal if it broke a leg or developed certain illnesses. Riding itself was no pleasure cruise. Saddles in the 1870s weren't designed for comfort, but for function. Hours in the saddle left even experienced riders with blisters and aching muscles. And if your horse spooked at a snake or sudden noise, which happened frequently, you could easily be thrown, potentially suffering broken bones or worse, miles from any help. If you couldn't afford a horse, you might travel by wagon. Forget the romantic image of pioneers cheerfully rolling across pristine prairies. Wagon travel was brutally uncomfortable. The vehicles had no suspension system beyond the slight given wooden wheels, meaning you felt every rock, rut, and hole in the trail. The constant jarring caused wagon sickness, similar to seasickness, leaving travelers nauseous and miserable. Roads, if they existed at all, were typically just dirt tracks carved by previous travelers. After rain, they became muddy quagmires where wagons could sink axle deep. During dry periods, the dust was so thick you could barely breathe or see. Wagons frequently broke down with wheels cracking or axles snapping miles from the nearest settlement. Let's say you've decided to journey all the way to California or Oregon. You've joined a wagon train heading west on the famous Oregon Trail. This 2,000-mile journey was one of the most perilous undertakings of the 19th century. Of the approximately 400,000 people who attempted it between the 1840s and 1860s, an estimated 1 in 10 didn't survive. The Oregon Trail was sometimes called the nation's longest graveyard. Some historians estimate that an average of 10 to 15 people died for every mile of the trail. Think about that. A grave every 350 feet or so for 2,000 miles. The trail was lined with makeshift crosses and stone markers, many without names, as families were forced to bury loved ones and continue their journey. Disease was the #1 killer on the Oregon Trail. Cholera, a bacterial infection spread through contaminated water, was particularly devastating. This horrible illness caused severe diarrhea and vomiting, draining the body of fluids so quickly that a person could be healthy at breakfast and dead by dinner. There was no effective treatment available. Wagon trains would sometimes lose dozens of people in a single cholera outbreak. Other diseases like dysentery, typhoid, and mountain fever claimed countless lives. Children were especially vulnerable, with many families losing multiple children during the journey. Medical care was rudimentary at best, often consisting of folk remedies that did little to help and sometimes made conditions worse. Crossing rivers presented another deadly challenge. Wagons weren't designed to float, but pioneers had to cross numerous rivers on their journey west. Some had ferries or forts, but many required the wagon to be floated across like a makeshift boat. Wagons frequently capsized in these crossings, drowning people and livestock and destroying precious supplies. The Platte, Columbia, and Snake Rivers claimed hundreds of lives during the migration period. Here's a quirky historical detail that often gets overlooked. Some wagon train leaders hired Native American guides specifically because they knew the safest crossing points. Yet these same guides were often blamed when crossings went wrong, even though they were typically hired for their expertise. Contrary to popular belief, attacks by Native Americans were relatively rare. Most tribes were actually helpful to migrants, offering supplies, guidance, and assistance with river crossings. The majority of violent deaths on the trail came from accidents, being crushed by wagon wheels, drowning, or being kicked by draft animals. Firearms accidents were shockingly common, as most travelers were inexperienced with weapons, but carried them for hunting and protection. Historians still argue about the exact ratio of accidental deaths to deaths from hostile encounters, but the consensus is clear. The wilderness itself was far more dangerous than the people already living in it. The psychological toll of the journey was immense. Families buried children, parents, and spouses along the way, and then had to continue traveling immediately. There was no time for extended grief on the trail. Each day's delay meant less chance of crossing the mountains before winter snows made passes impossible. The constant stress, grief, and physical hardship led many travelers to mental breakdown. Suicide was not uncommon among trail migrants, a reality that contemporary diaries record, but popular history often glosses over. If you somehow survived the journey to California or Oregon, your challenges weren't over. Many arrived at their destination having spent all their money and resources on the journey itself. Families often arrived destitute, malnourished, and ill, only to find that the promised land had its own harsh realities. The soil might be poor, the climate might be unfamiliar. Established settlers might view newcomers with suspicion or hostility. The dream of starting fresh sometimes curdled into the nightmare of starting over with nothing. But let's say you've decided not to travel that far. Perhaps you're heading to a nearby town or settlement instead. Even short journeys in the Wild West presented significant dangers. Travelers might encounter outlaws who saw lone riders or small groups as easy targets. While the frequency of stagecoach robberies was exaggerated in later fiction, they did occur regularly enough to be a legitimate concern. The natural environment posed constant threats. Flash floods could wash out trails, or trap unwary travelers. Summer heat in desert regions could kill through dehydration and heat stroke. Winter blizzards routinely trapped travelers, sometimes leading to freezing deaths or desperate situations like the infamous Donner Party, where survivors resorted to cannibalism to stay alive. Navigation itself was challenging in an era before detailed maps. Travelers relied on vague directions, landmarks that could change or be misidentified, and the experience of guides who sometimes proved unreliable. Getting lost in the wilderness could be a death sentence, especially if your supplies ran low. You might wander for days thinking you were heading toward civilization, only to realize you'd been traveling in circles. As you travel today, you notice another aspect of frontier life that movies rarely depict accurately: the stunning diversity of people. The Wild West wasn't populated solely by white cowboys and settlers. It was a meeting ground of cultures from around the world. Chinese immigrants worked as railroad builders, miners, and merchants. Mexican families had been living in the Southwest long before it became U.S. territory. Black cowboys made up as much as 25% of the workforce on some ranches. European immigrants from Germany, Ireland, Italy, and Scandinavia brought their cultures and traditions. And of course, dozens of distinct Native American nations had called these lands home for thousands of years before others arrived. This diversity, however, didn't mean equality or harmony. Racial violence was a common feature of frontier life. Chinese railroad workers faced brutal discrimination and were often forced to take the most dangerous jobs for lower pay than white workers. Mexican landowners frequently saw their property seized through legal manipulation or outright theft after the Mexican-American War. Black Americans who moved west hoping to escape Southern discrimination often found frontier racism just as entrenched, if different in form. Despite their crucial contributions to ranching, mining, and building frontier communities, they were frequently excluded from economic opportunities and social acceptance. For Native Americans, the expansion of white settlement was nothing short of catastrophic. The indigenous population of North America, once numbering perhaps 15 million people, had been reduced to fewer than 300,000 by 1900. Disease, warfare, forced relocation, and the deliberate destruction of their food sources, particularly the buffalo, decimated numerous tribes and nations. U.S. government policies systematically pushed Native Americans from their traditional lands onto reservations, often in areas with poor soil and few resources. Treaties were regularly broken when valuable resources were discovered on reservation lands. Native children were taken from their families and placed in boarding schools designed to erase their cultural identity, operating under the philosophy of kill the Indian, save the manual. The romanticized cowboys versus Indians narratives of later films grossly misrepresented the complex interactions between settlers and indigenous peoples. Many native nations initially tried to accommodate newcomers and adapt to changing circumstances. Violence typically erupted after repeated treaty violations, encroachment on tribal lands, or deliberate provocations. Historians still argue about the extent to which early frontier interactions could have developed differently had European settlement proceeded with genuine respect for indigenous sovereignty. But what's clear is that by the 1870s, the trajectory was locked in. As you continue your journey, you ponder another group whose experience differed markedly from Hollywood depictions. Women on the frontier, far from the helpless damsels or schoolmarm archetypes of Western movies. Frontier women performed incredibly demanding physical labor while navigating restrictive social expectations. On homesteads and farms, women not only handled traditional domestic duties like cooking, cleaning, child care, and making clothing, but also worked in the fields, tended livestock, and defended the home when necessary. Their workday typically started before dawn and ended well after dark, with few, if any, days of rest. A frontier woman might need to plow fields in the morning, deliver a neighbor's baby at midday, fight off predators threatening the livestock in the afternoon, and still prepare meals and care for her own children throughout. Many women became widows young due to the dangerous nature of frontier life and had to manage farms or businesses alone while raising children. Despite their essential contributions, women had few legal rights. In most territories and states, they couldn't vote, own property independently if married, or have custody of their children in the event of divorce. Domestic violence was considered a private matter with little legal recourse available to victims. For unmarried women, options were severely limited. Teaching was one of the few respectable professions, though female teachers were paid significantly less than their male counterparts and were often expected to resign upon marriage. Some women found economic independence through running boarding houses, working as nurses, or establishing millinery or dressmaking businesses. Then there were the soiled doves, prostitutes who worked in frontier brothels and saloons. While later mythology romanticized these women, the reality was typically grim. Many entered the profession out of economic desperation after being widowed or abandoned. Physical abuse, drug addiction, and venereal disease were common hazards of the work. Even those who managed to earn substantial money found themselves socially ostracized and unable to transition to more respectable positions. Some women did find greater freedom on the frontier than they might have back east. The shortage of women in Western territories gave them more marriage options and sometimes better treatment as communities competed to attract and keep female residents. A few territories, like Wyoming and Utah, granted women voting rights decades before the 19th Amendment, recognizing their essential contributions to frontier development. Here's a quirky historical detail that often surprises people. Wyoming's decision to grant women the vote in 1869 wasn't purely progressive idealism. It was also a calculated move to attract female settlers and their families to a sparsely populated territory. As evening approaches and you find shelter for the night in a small frontier hotel, you contemplate what you've learned about this supposedly lawless land. The reality was complex and varied widely by location. Major cities and towns typically had some form of organized law enforcement, but vast rural areas had minimal, if any, official protection. County sheriffs were elected officials responsible for maintaining order across sometimes enormous territories. A single sheriff might be the only law enforcement for thousands of square miles, making regular patrols impossible. They relied heavily on deputizing ordinary citizens during emergencies, creating posses to pursue criminals or respond to violence. Town marshals handled law enforcement within town limits, sometimes with a few deputies in larger settlements. These positions were often dangerous and poorly paid, attracting a mix of dedicated public servants and those who enjoyed the power the badge provided. Some famous lawmen, like Wyatt Burke, moved between legitimate law enforcement and more questionable enterprises throughout their careers. Federal marshals had jurisdiction throughout territories and states, but were few in number. They typically focused on major crimes like counterfeiting, mail robbery, or offenses involving multiple jurisdictions. The legendary U.S. Marshals of Western movies, single-handedly bringing law to lawless towns, were largely fictional creations. In many remote areas, justice was handled through informal community action rather than official legal processes. Vigilante groups formed to address perceived threats when formal law enforcement was absent or ineffective. Sometimes these groups maintained basic order, but they could easily become vehicles for prejudice, personal vendettas, or mob violence. The iconic image of the quick-draw gunfight was largely a later invention. Most frontier violence was mundane, impulsive, and often alcohol-fueled. Bar fights that escalated to fatal levels, domestic violence, and disputes over land or livestock were far more common than dramatic shootouts on dusty streets. Criminal punishment was harsh by modern standards. Hanging was the standard penalty for murder, rape, and sometimes theft, particularly of horses or cattle. Prisons existed, but were primitive facilities with high mortality rates from disease, violence, and poor conditions. Many communities preferred immediate execution to the expense of long-term imprisonment. You might be hanged on a Monday for a crime committed on Saturday, with minimal investigation and no formal trial. As darkness falls, you find yourself reflecting on how the mythology of frontier law enforcement bears almost no resemblance to the messy, often corrupt reality. The few famous gunfighters who captured public imagination operated in a specific historical window when formal law enforcement was establishing itself against pre-existing systems of personal and community violence. By the 1880s and 90s, professional police forces and court systems had replaced vigilante justice in most established communities, though remote areas still saw occasional eruptions of frontier-style conflict resolution. The legendary figures Wild Bill Hickok, Wyatt Earp, Billy the Kid, Jesse James operated in this transitional period, often moving back and forth between legal and illegal activities as circumstances changed. Their later mythologization obscured the complex, often morally ambiguous reality of their lives. Hickok, far from the perfect marksman of legend, shot bystanders in at least 2 gunfights. Earp worked variously as a lawman, gambler, brothel keeper, and vigilante across his career. The Robin Hood image attached to Jesse James ignored his Confederate guerrilla background and the innocent victims of his robberies. Your hotel room tonight is Spartan, but better than sleeping outdoors. A simple bed, possibly infested with bed bugs, a washstand with a pitcher and basin, and perhaps a chair. Bathroom facilities are an outhouse in the back shared by all guests. Privacy is minimal with thin walls, allowing you to hear your neighbor's every movement and conversation. In busier establishments, you might even share a bed with a stranger, a common practice to maximize capacity during busy periods. The sheets might not have been changed for previous guests, and lighting is limited to candles or oil lamps. A night's lodging costs between 25 cents and $1, depending on the establishment's quality and location. This represents a significant expense for many travelers, equivalent to several hours' wages for an average worker. As you lie in bed, your mind drifts to something you haven't experienced yet in this frontier journey. Serious illness or injury. Let's imagine the scenario differently. You wake tomorrow morning with a sharp pain in your leg. Looking down, you see a wound that's become infected, perhaps from a cut you didn't think was serious, or from an encounter with something sharp during yesterday's travels. The skin around it is red, warm to the touch, and beginning to swell. You know something is wrong, but you're miles from any doctor. And even if you reach one, what happens next would terrify you. Medical care in the 1870s frontier was primitive at best and actively harmful at worst. Most doctors had little or no formal training. Some had apprenticed with other practitioners. Others simply hung out a shingle and claimed expertise they didn't possess. Surgical procedures were performed without effective anesthesia beyond whiskey or morphine, and sterilization was virtually unknown. The concept of germ theory was only beginning to circulate in medical circles, and many frontier practitioners actively rejected it as pseudoscience. Something as simple as an infected cut could lead to amputation or death. Common treatments included bloodletting, slicing open a vein to let blood drain away, mercury compounds, arsenic, and other toxic substances that often did more harm than good. The infection in your leg is spreading. By the second day, you're running a fever. By the third day, you can barely walk. If you make it to a frontier doctor, he might recommend amputation. Better to lose the leg than lose your life, he'd say. And he wouldn't be entirely wrong by the standards of the time. But amputation itself carried enormous risk. The surgery would be performed with saws and knives wiped clean perhaps, but never properly sterilized. You'd be given whiskey to numb the pain, which wouldn't really work, and possibly some laudanum, a tincture of opium that would make you drowsy, but not unconscious. You'd feel every moment of the amputation. You'd smell your own flesh burning as the surgeon cauterized the stump to stop the bleeding. And after it was over, you'd still likely develop an infection in the stump that could kill you anyway. Here's a quirky historical detail that often gets overlooked. Frontier surgeons sometimes amputated limbs based on superstition rather than medical necessity. Some believed that certain phases of the moon affected healing. Others thought that operating under specific constellations improved outcomes. None of this had any basis in reality, but patients sometimes died because surgery was delayed waiting for the right astronomical conditions. Women in childbirth faced perhaps the starkest contrast between frontier and modern medical experiences. Women typically gave birth at home, attended by a midwife if one was available, or female relatives if not. Without prenatal care, many complications weren't identified until labor was underway. Breech births, hemorrhage, and other emergencies that modern medicine handles routinely often resulted in the death of mother, child, or both. Maternal mortality rates on the frontier were approximately 1 death per 100 births, more than 100 times higher than in developed countries today. Many women approached each pregnancy knowing it might be their last experience in life. Men's diaries and letters from the period frequently mention the heartbreaking reality of raising children alone after losing wives in childbirth. If you survived your infected leg, either through amputation and subsequent recovery, or through sheer luck and your body's own immune system, you'd face years of disability or chronic pain. Frontier life offered no accommodation for the disabled. You either found ways to work despite your condition, or you became a burden on your family. There was no social safety net, no disability payments, no ergonomic modifications to tools or tasks. If you couldn't work, you didn't eat. It was that simple. Beyond medical crises, frontier life imposed a form of isolation and disconnection that modern people accustomed to instant global communication would find almost unbearable. This isolation shaped frontier psychology and culture in profound ways. Communication with distant family or friends occurred at the speed of physical transportation. Letters took weeks or months to reach recipients, if they arrived at all. News traveled slowly and unreliably, often distorted through retelling. Major events might not become known in remote areas until months after they occurred. This information vacuum contributed to a highly localized worldview where distant events seemed abstract and irrelevant compared to immediate community concerns. The isolation was particularly difficult for those accustomed to more settled environments. Women who had grown up with close female friendships and family networks often found themselves alone for days or weeks while husbands traveled for supplies or work. Their diaries frequently mention crippling loneliness and the psychological strain of having no adult conversation for extended periods. Some frontier wives went months without seeing another woman. The nearest neighbor might be 5 miles away, and visiting required traveling that distance on horseback or on foot, leaving household tasks unattended and children unsupervised. This isolation sometimes led to what contemporary accounts called prairie madness, severe depression, anxiety, and occasionally psychosis triggered by the combination of isolation, constant work, and environmental hardships. Some affected individuals became violent toward family members or committed suicide. Others simply abandoned their homesteads and returned east, unable to endure the psychological pressure of frontier life. Historians still argue about how widespread this condition actually was versus how much it was romanticized in later accounts. But the underlying reality is undisputed. The frontier could break people psychologically, not just physically. Even in established communities, social connections were limited by practical constraints. Visiting neighbors might require traveling several miles each way, a significant undertaking when time was precious and transportation limited to walking or horseback. Formal social gatherings were infrequent, typically centered around church services, seasonal celebrations, or community work events like barn raisings or harvest festivals. Churches played a crucial role in frontier communities beyond their spiritual function. They served as social hubs, educational centers, and mutual aid societies. Even those with limited religious conviction often participated in church activities for the community connection they provided. Religious leaders, ministers, priests, or lay preachers frequently took on roles far beyond religious guidance, serving as teachers, dispute mediators, and community organizers. The establishment of community institutions marked important milestones in frontier development. Building a school, church, or meeting hall represented a commitment to permanent settlement rather than temporary exploitation. These institutions helped transform mining camps or trading posts into towns with collective identities and shared futures. Frontier communities also developed distinctive forms of mutual aid and collective action necessary for survival in harsh conditions. Barn raisings and house raisings allowed families to complete large construction projects impossible for individual households. Harvest teams moved from farm to farm, ensuring crops were gathered before weather could destroy them. Spontaneous search parties formed when children went missing. These cooperative traditions reflected the practical reality that no individual or family could survive the frontier entirely through self-reliance. This community interdependence existed alongside the individualism that later became mythologized in frontier narratives. Both elements were necessary responses to frontier conditions. Self-reliance for daily survival, community cooperation for challenges beyond individual capacity. The tension between these values shaped frontier culture and continues to influence American attitudes toward government, community, and individual responsibility. Historians still debate which value was more central to frontier identity, but most agree that both were equally essential. As your final day in the Wild West draws to a close, you find yourself contemplating the gap between frontier reality and the mythology that would later emerge from it. Why did Americans, and eventually the world, become so fascinated with a romanticized version of this brutal period? What needs did these myths serve? And what truths did they obscure? Part of the answer lies in timing. The most intense period of frontier mythology making occurred precisely as the actual frontier was disappearing. These performances weren't meant as accurate historical recreations, but as entertainment that resonated with Eastern ideas about the West. The dime novels that popularized exaggerated tales of Western heroes originated not on the frontier, but in Eastern publishing houses, written by authors who rarely had first-hand experience of the regions they described. These formulaic stories emphasized action, clear moral distinctions between heroes and villains, and a vision of the West as a testing ground for American virtues of self-reliance, courage, and individualism. Later, Hollywood Westerns further refined and amplified these mythological elements, creating iconic images of lone cowboys, heroic sheriffs, dastardly outlaws, and savage Indians that bore little resemblance to historical reality. These films served psychological and cultural functions beyond entertainment. They offered reassuring narratives about American identity during periods of rapid social change and international challenges. The mythology suggested that American character had been forged in frontier conditions, producing exceptional qualities that distinguished the nation from older societies. It implied that American expansion across the continent had been not just inevitable, but morally justified. a triumph of civilization over wilderness and progress over primitive cultures. What these myths obscured was the complex, morally ambiguous reality of Western development, the genocide of indigenous peoples, the exploitation of immigrant labor, the environmental devastation, the corporate manipulation of political systems, and the deeply divided communities struggling with fundamental questions about identity, governance, and resources. The real West offered no simple moral lessons, but rather a case study in how human societies adapt to challenging conditions, sometimes showing remarkable cooperation and creativity, sometimes descending into exploitation and brutality. Most scholars now argue for a more nuanced position, that mythology serves multiple functions simultaneously, containing both genuine admiration for frontier resilience and deliberate distortion of inconvenient truths. Let's talk about the specific industries that shaped frontier life and death. Say you decided to try your hand at mining instead of farming or ranching. The California gold rush of 1849 had drawn hundreds of thousands west with dreams of instant wealth. By the 1870s, most of those dreams had curdled into disappointment or disaster. Mining was one of the deadliest professions on the frontier. Underground cave-ins, toxic gas exposure, explosions from improperly handled blasting powder, and machinery accidents claimed countless lives. Miners also suffered from long-term health issues like black lung from coal dust or mercury poisoning from gold processing. For all these risks and hardships, what was the likely reward? Despite the mythology of the lucky prospector, the vast majority of miners barely earned subsistence wages. By the 1870s, most worked for large mining companies rather than independently, earning $2 to $3 for a grueling 10 to 12-hour day. Studies suggest that storekeepers, saloon owners, and prostitutes consistently made more money than the miners, whose dreams sustained frontier mining towns. Mining towns themselves were notoriously rough places. Imagine a community composed primarily of young single men engaged in dangerous work with few women, families, or civilizing institutions. Alcohol consumption was astronomical. The average mining camp resident consumed several times more alcohol than the typical American today. Violence was commonplace, with fights, stabbings, and shootings occurring regularly. Sanitation in mining camps was typically abysmal, with minimal planning or infrastructure. Human waste and garbage accumulated in streets and waterways. Typhoid, cholera, and dysentery spread rapidly in these conditions. During warm months, the stench could be overwhelming, and swarms of flies spread disease from waste to food. If you managed to find valuable ore, you faced the challenge of converting it to cash. Banking in the Wild West was primitive and often predatory. Many mining towns had no banks at all, forcing miners to carry gold, dust, or ore, making them targets for theft. Some saloons and general stores offered to buy gold, but frequently at rates far below actual value, taking advantage of miners' limited options. Where banks did exist, they operated with minimal regulation or oversight. Bank failures were common, often wiping out customers' life savings without warning or recourse. Many bankers were little more than confidence men who established storefronts, collected deposits, and disappeared overnight with all the funds. Perhaps after considering the dangers and disappointments of mining, you decide to try ranching instead. The cattle industry was booming in the 1870s with demand for beef in eastern cities, creating opportunities on the frontier. Surely this would be a healthier, more profitable venture? Ranching did indeed avoid some of the worst health hazards of mining, but it introduced its own unique dangers and hardships. Starting a ranch required significant capital. Land, livestock, equipment, and buildings all represented major investments. Many aspiring ranchers went deeply into debt, purchasing these necessities and betting their future on favorable weather and market conditions. Nature often had other plans. Droughts could wither grazing lands and dry up crucial water sources, forcing ranchers to either watch their cattle starve or sell at devastating losses. Harsh winters could kill entire herds, as happened in the infamous Great Die-Up of 1886 to 1887, when up to 90% of cattle on northern ranges froze or starved to death during unusually severe weather. Disease could sweep through herds, wiping out a rancher's investment overnight. Texas fever, anthrax, and other infectious diseases had no effective treatments in the 1870s. Predators like wolves and cougars took a constant toll on livestock, particularly vulnerable calves. Poisonous plants, quicksand, and injuries further reduced herds. The iconic cattle drives, moving herds hundreds of miles to railroad shipping points, were not romantic adventures, but grueling, dangerous undertakings. Cowboys, not the glamorous figures of later films, but typically young, poorly paid laborers, worked 20-hour days during drives, catching brief naps in the saddle as they moved thousands of animals across difficult terrain. These drives faced constant threats. River crossings could turn deadly in minutes if animals panicked, creating deadly pileups that drowned cattle and cowboys alike. Stampedes, which could be triggered by something as simple as a lightning strike or a snapping twig, turned thousands of 1,500-pound animals into an unstoppable, destructive force. Cowboys caught in stampedes were often trampled to death. The cowboy's life was far from the freedom portrayed in Western mythology. They typically earned about $30 per month for exhausting, dangerous work. Most were very young men, often teenagers from poor backgrounds with few other options. A significant percentage were Black, Mexican, or mixed-race individuals facing discrimination that limited their opportunities elsewhere. Perhaps ranching doesn't appeal after all. What about farming? Surely growing food, the most fundamental of human activity, would offer a more stable and less dangerous way of life on the frontier. This seemed like an incredible opportunity, a chance for people with little money to become landowners and build independent livelihoods. The reality proved far more challenging than the promise. First, 160 acres might sound substantial, but in the arid regions that comprise much of the available land, it was often insufficient to support a family. Traditional Eastern farming methods failed in these environments where rainfall was a fraction of what pioneers were accustomed to. Many settlers had no knowledge of dry farming techniques needed for success in these regions. Starting a frontier farm required tremendous physical labor. The first task was building shelter, typically a sod house on the treeless plains. constructed by cutting and stacking dense prairie turf. These sod houses were dark, damp dwellings that leaked when it rained, harbored insects and snakes, and crumbled without constant maintenance. Then came the back-breaking work of breaking the land for planting. Prairie sod held together by dense grass roots that had developed over centuries was extraordinarily difficult to plow with the equipment available to most settlers. It could take a year or more just to prepare a few acres for planting. The work was so physically demanding that it permanently damaged many farmers' bodies, leaving them hunched and arthritic by their 40s. Once crops were planted, farmers faced threats from every direction. Drought could wither plants before harvest. Torrential rains could wash away seedlings or flood fields. Early frost could kill crops just before harvest. Grasshoppers descended in biblical swarms, consuming everything green in their path, and sometimes even eating the handles of tools left in fields. A single locust plague could destroy an entire season's work in days, leaving families facing starvation. Disease affected frontier farmers as it did everyone else, but with particularly devastating consequences. With no hired help and little community support, a family's illness during crucial planting or harvesting periods could mean the difference between survival and starvation. Women often continued working the fields while heavily pregnant or just days after giving birth, risking their health because the work simply couldn't wait. Farm accidents were common and often fatal. Homemade tools broke and caused injuries. Animals panicked and trampled their handlers. Even successful harvests could turn deadly. Numerous farmers died when they fell into grain storage bins and suffocated in the loose grain, or when poorly constructed storage buildings collapsed under the weight of their contents. The isolation of frontier farms took a heavy psychological toll. Neighbors might be miles away, visited only occasionally. Women in particular suffered from this isolation. Some went months without speaking to anyone outside their immediate family. Depression, anxiety, and what was then called prairie madness affected many settlers, sometimes leading to abandonment of homesteads or suicide. For those who persevered through these challenges and actually produced crops, economic obstacles remained. Transportation to markets was difficult and expensive. Without refrigeration, perishable products had to be sold quickly or preserved. Large agricultural corporations and railroad companies used their influence to keep crop prices low and transportation costs high, squeezing independent farmers from both directions. By the 1870s, another option was emerging on the frontier: working for wages in the growing towns and industries. Perhaps this offered a safer, more stable path than the high-risk ventures of mining, ranching, or farming. Wage labor did avoid some of the worst physical dangers and financial risks of independent enterprises, but it introduced its own hardships. Industrial safety standards were virtually non-existent. Workers in frontier factories, mills, and workshops suffered horrific injuries from unguarded machinery. Construction workers built increasingly tall structures without harnesses or safety equipment, leading to frequent fatal falls. Railroad work was particularly dangerous. Track layers worked with minimal equipment under brutal conditions, suffering high rates of injury and death from accidents, heat stroke, and exhaustion. Chinese workers, who built much of the transcontinental railroad, were often assigned the most dangerous tasks, such as handling unstable explosives to blast through mountain passes. Working hours were long by modern standards, typically 10 to 12 hours per day, 6 days per week. Pay was low, with most workers barely earning subsistence wages. Child labor was common, with children as young as 8 or 9 working alongside adults in many industries, often suffering higher injury rates due to their size and inexperience. Workers had essentially no legal protections. Employers could fire people without cause, reduce wages arbitrarily, or withhold pay entirely. Those who complained or attempted to organize for better conditions faced blacklisting, being marked as troublemakers whom no other employer in the region would hire. Company towns, settlements where a single employer owned all housing and businesses, were common in mining and lumber regions. Workers in these communities paid inflated prices at company stores, lived in company housing, and sometimes were paid in script, company currency, rather than legal tender. This created a form of debt bondage where workers could never save enough to escape the system. Whether you mined, ranched, farmed, or worked for wages, frontier life shaped your experiences in ways modern people would find disorienting. Perhaps most striking was the relationship with time, not the carefully measured minutes and hours of our digital age, but a more fluid reality governed by daylight, seasons, and natural rhythms. Without electric lighting, most people woke at dawn and slept shortly after sunset. Their active hours expanded and contracted with the seasons. Work wasn't measured in 8-hour shifts, but by tasks that needed completion. Fields plowed, cattle moved, or extracted. During harvest or roundup, people might work from first light until well after dark for weeks without a break. During winter, many rural workers had periods of relative inactivity when fields lay dormant or cattle needed minimal tending. The concept of punctuality, so central to modern life, had limited relevance on the frontier. Morning or after dinner were sufficiently specific time designations for most purposes. Stagecoaches and later trains introduced more precise timekeeping to the West. But outside these specific contexts, formal scheduling remained largely foreign to frontier life. Entertainment and leisure looked nothing like their modern counterparts. After exhausting work days, most frontier folks had little energy for complex activities. Conversation around the fire, storytelling, or simple card games were common evening pastimes. Music was popular when instruments and skilled players were available: fiddles, harmonicas, and guitars providing accompaniment for social dances. Reading material was precious and often shared among entire communities. A single book might be read aloud to gatherings of neighbors or passed from family to family until it fell apart from use. Newspapers, when available, were read repeatedly, with every advertisement and notice scrutinized for information about the wider world. Organized sports existed, but in simpler forms than today. Baseball was gaining popularity, played with minimal equipment on makeshift fields. Horse racing, wrestling, and shooting competitions provided both entertainment and opportunities to demonstrate valuable skills. Children played games that required little or no equipment: tag, hide and seek, and variations of stickball that could be played with found objects. Holidays and community celebrations took on great importance as rare opportunities for socializing and recreation. 4th of July celebrations might draw people from miles around for picnics, speeches, games, and dancing. Harvest festivals mark the successful completion of the year's most critical work. Religious holidays provided both spiritual meaning and welcome breaks from routine. These gatherings represented more than entertainment. They were essential for maintaining psychological health and community bonds in conditions where isolation was the default state. As the day draws to a close and the frontier fades into twilight, you find yourself reflecting on the relentless challenges of this unforgiving world. Every aspect of frontier life required harder work, involved greater risk, and offered fewer comforts than its modern equivalent. The darkness gathers once more, and with it comes a silence profound enough to hear your own heartbeat. No car engines, no air conditioners, no electronic hums, just the whisper of wind, the chorus of insects, and the occasional call of night birds. This profound quiet, so alien to modern ears, was the soundtrack of frontier nights, sometimes comforting, sometimes unsettling in its emptiness. As you drift towards sleep, you wonder if you would have had what it took to survive here, not just for a day or a week, but for years and decades. The people who shaped the American West, for better and worse, were not the idealized heroes of later fiction, but complex individuals facing extraordinary challenges with the limited resources and knowledge of their time. Their story, stripped of romanticism, is one of human endurance against conditions that would break many of us today. The cool night air settles around you like a blanket, and the stars emerge in a display of brilliance impossible to see in our light-polluted modern world. Tomorrow you'll return to your own time, carrying with you a deeper understanding of this pivotal period in American history. You'll never again see a Western film or read a frontier novel without recognizing the sanitized, simplified version of a complex reality. You'll appreciate the extraordinary comfort and security of modern life, achieved through technological advances unimaginable to frontier dwellers. Most importantly, you'll understand that the real story of the American West isn't found in gunfights and gold strikes, but in the daily struggles of ordinary people, men, women, and children of diverse backgrounds who faced extraordinary challenges with the limited resources available to them. Their story, without Hollywood embellishment, contains enough genuine courage, tragedy, innovation, conflict, cooperation, cruelty, and kindness to fill countless histories. Their legacy lives in the communities they established, the environmental changes they initiated, the cultural patterns they created, and the myths that grew from their experiences. The real Wild West disappeared long ago, transformed by technology, population growth, economic integration, and environmental change into the modern American West of cities, suburbs, highways, and managed landscapes. Yet echoes of frontier experience persist in regional identities, local traditions, land use patterns, and governance structures. The memory of this formative period continues to influence how Americans understand themselves and their nation's development, even as scholars and communities work to replace simplistic mythology with more accurate, inclusive understandings of this complex history. Sleep comes at last, and with it dreams of a West both harsh and magnificent, a place where human vulnerability and resilience were displayed in equal measure, where diverse peoples collided and sometimes cooperated in ways that would shape a nation, and where the daily struggle for existence contained moments of transcendent connection with landscapes of breathtaking grandeur.